In the winter of 1892, residents of Mexico City's most prestigious neighborhood started circulating hushed rumors about noises that sent shivers down their spines. From behind the stately stone perimeter of Atuba Street Manor, screams erupted, so high-pitched and full of torment that even seasoned police officers would later admit the sounds tormented their sleep for years. These were not the common outcries of political turmoil or street violence that had become a regular feature of Porfirio Diaz's Mexico. No, these indicated a depravity far greater: the organized and precise torture of children, orchestrated by a woman whose respectable appearance had successfully deceived an entire populace. What law enforcement found within that residence would profoundly shock Mexico and expose the psyche of the nation's first recognized female serial killer. Her offenses were so utterly vile that the renowned artist José Guadalupe Posada would immortalize her wickedness in disturbing illustrations that retain their capacity to unsettle audiences, even now. Before we delve deeper into the narrative of Guadalupe Martinez de Bejrang, historically infamous as La Loba, the she-wolf, the terrifying one, if you are drawn to true crime accounts that peer into the most sinister facets of human behavior, ensure you subscribe to our channel and activate the notification bell. Please like this video if you are brave enough to confront the whole truth, and tell us in the comments which state and city you are tuning in from. Your patronage is vital, allowing us to continue investigating these unsettling cases that history has attempted to conceal. The story I am about to recount has been largely overlooked, obscured by decades of denial and disgrace. Yet it must be told not merely for its shocking content, but because it illustrates how maliciousness can lurk behind the most socially acceptable exteriors, and how societal negligence can create fertile hunting grounds for dangerous individuals. The year was 1887, and Mexico City was a tense mix of extremes, reflecting President Porfirio Diaz's ambitious campaign for modernization. Gas streetlights illuminated recently paved avenues where opulent horse-drawn carriages conveyed women dressed in imported European silks, passing by destitute beggars who had gone without food for days. The affluent districts symbolized Mexico's ambition to be considered among the developed nations. Simultaneously, just a few blocks away, indigenous families were squeezed into dilapidated apartment buildings, their children emaciated from poverty and despair. Within this framework of harsh inequality, Guadalupe Martinez de Bejrang commanded significant esteem. At 43, she was a widow with an impeccable reputation, who had managed to sustain her late husband's social standing through astute commercial activities and the careful nurturing of connections with Mexico City's high society. Her commanding two-story residence on Tuba Street, complete with wrought iron balconies and a pink limestone facade, communicated the prestige expected of a woman of her social status. Guadalupe herself was an imposing figure, tall and severe. She wore her black widow's clothing like a form of protection, her dark hair severely pulled back, highlighting the sharp angles of her face. Her neighbors regarded her as a devout Catholic who faithfully attended Sunday Mass, a generous donor to religious charities, and a businesswoman who supplied domestic help to the city's most distinguished households. What remained unknown was that Guadalupe had developed what she secretly referred to as her special method for training young servants. In the secluded servants' quarters, she had created a private space for human anguish, a setting where she could indulge the darkest urges that societal propriety mandated she suppress. Her son, Aurelio, then 22, inhabited the upper level of the mansion, living a life of quiet isolation. He was slight and anxious, with the pallid complexion of a person who rarely ventured outside. He had grown up learning to make himself inconspicuous whenever his mother's eyes took on that distinct gleam that signaled the commencement of what she termed discipline sessions. He had developed a debilitating stammer and a reliance on laudanum, which helped him sleep through the horrifying sounds emanating from the downstairs area. Guadalupe's employment model was perfectly suited to her clandestine activities. Destitute families from Mexico's impoverished rural areas sent their young daughters to the capital to find work as household staff. These girls arrived without social contacts, identification papers, and often were illiterate. If they vanished, there was rarely anyone with the social standing to raise uncomfortable inquiries. However, Guadalupe had been cautious during her initial period of experimentation. She restricted herself to what she described as minor corrections, punishments that left no enduring physical marks, shaming techniques that could be rationalized as character development. It wasn't until 1887 that she crossed the line into homicide. The morning of January 18, 1887 was overcast and cold in Mexico City. A delicate fog rose from the ancient lake bed that underlies a large part of the capital, lending the streets an ethereal quality that seemed to dampen noise and soften the boundaries of reality. It was on this particular morning that Casimira Juarez, a 16-year-old girl from the mountains of Michoacán, rapped on the ornate wooden door of Guadalupe Bejrang's mansion. Casimira had journeyed for 6 days to arrive in the capital, carrying all her possessions in a small cloth bundle. Her parents had succumbed to a cholera epidemic the previous year, leaving her with no family or prospects in her home village. The local parish priest had provided her with a letter of recommendation and the address of Señora Bejrang, who was known across the region for her philanthropic efforts in securing respectable placements for young women. When Guadalupe opened the door, her experienced gaze immediately assessed the girl standing before her. Casimira was precisely what she sought. Young, defenseless, alone, and displaying that specific look of desperate thankfulness common to those with no other choice. Her dark hair was neatly braided, her simple dress was clean but patched, and her large eyes held a mix of optimism and apprehension that Guadalupe found immensely gratifying. "I can see you've been raised properly," Guadalupe remarked after reviewing the priest's letter. "Good references are non-negotiable in my home. I uphold extremely rigorous standards." She guided Casimira through the mansion's marble-floored corridors, past religious artworks and heavy, conservative furnishings that hinted at generational wealth and traditional principles. The girl's chamber was small but spotless, containing a narrow bed, a wash basin, and a wall crucifix. "You will find that I treat my servants equitably," Guadalupe stated, "but I demand absolute obedience and discretion. The families I attend to expect nothing less." For the first 2 weeks, Casimira's existence in the mansion followed a routine that felt nearly pleasant compared to the hardships she had recently faced. She awoke before dawn to assist in preparing breakfast, spent her mornings cleaning the primary rooms and her afternoons helping with laundry and mending. Guadalupe observed her constantly, but the girl interpreted this as the normal vigilance of a conscientious employer. What Casimira failed to grasp was that she was being scrutinized with the focused attention of a researcher examining a test subject. Guadalupe meticulously logged every facet of the girl's conduct. How she reacted to criticism, what provoked her fear, how much physical discomfort she could endure before tears welled up in her eyes. She was formulating a plan that required an exact understanding of her victim's limits. The shift began subtly. Guadalupe started to find defects in Casimira's performance. Invisible dust, creases in perfectly smooth linens, food that was somehow poorly prepared despite strict adherence to the recipes. The girl would profusely apologize and exert herself harder, an effort that only seemed to escalate her employer's disapproval. "I am starting to believe you are not as well trained as your priest indicated," Guadalupe declared one evening, her voice carrying a coldness that made Casimira tremble. "Perhaps what you require is a more thorough instruction in correct behavior." The punishment started off minor. Casimira was compelled to stand motionless in the kitchen for hours, as penance for imagined errors. She was deprived of meals for being clumsy when she stumbled from exhaustion. She was ordered to scrub floors on her hands and knees until her palms bled, and then reprimanded for staining the stone with blood. Aurelio, observing from concealed spots, felt his stomach tighten with familiar dread. He had witnessed this pattern before with previous servants, although never taken to such extremes. When he attempted to speak to his mother about her mistreatment of the girl, Guadalupe's reaction was swift and terrifying. "I see you have forgotten who manages this household," she stated, her gaze turning cold as a winter rock. "Perhaps you would like to join Casimira in her instruction on respect and subservience." The warning was undeniable. Aurelio retreated to his room and increased his dose of laudanum, striving to dull his senses to the inevitable. By February, Casimira's life had turned into a living nightmare. What had begun as harsh discipline had progressed into systematic torment, designed to crush her will before destroying her body. Guadalupe had moved past simple malice into a realm that exposed the true depth of her mental disturbance. "Do you observe how unattractive you have become?" Guadalupe whispered. her voice infused with an unnerving closeness that was somehow more chilling than an outcry. This is the outcome when servants neglect their proper station. Nevertheless, do not worry. I am prepared to assist you in remembering. The brazier, which typically served to warm the mansion's chambers, was repurposed as an instrument of torment. Guadalupe would heat iron tools until they glowed a deep red, then deliberately move them closer to Casimira's skin, observing her face convulse with terror even before the pain registered. The physical contact was fleeting yet calculated, intended to inflict maximum suffering while carefully avoiding injuries that would result in immediate death. Between the sessions of torture, Guadalupe meticulously attended to the girl's injuries with clinical precision, applying medicinal salves that facilitated healing just rapidly enough for the agonizing ritual to be repeated. She had studied human anatomy and physiology with the rigorous focus of a medical practitioner, understanding precisely the amount of damage the human body could endure and still recover from. The psychological torment she employed was equally systematic. Guadalupe coerced Casimira into confessing to sins she had not committed, pleading for forgiveness for imagined misdeeds, and even expressing gratitude for the punishments that drove her closer to a mental breakdown. With the passage of each day, she systematically eroded the girl's grip on reality until Casimira was led to believe she genuinely deserved the agony being inflicted upon her. Aurelio, a prisoner in the floors above, struggled desperately to maintain his sanity while the sounds of torture resonated through the mansion's stone walls. He started keeping a journal, scribbling frantic observations in a handwriting that grew more chaotic with every entry. February 15th. The screams were more awful last night. I attempted to cover my ears, but the sound penetrates everything. Mother insists it is essential for the girl's moral development, but her eyes when she says this. God help me, I believe she derives pleasure from it. February 22nd. I discovered blood on the staircase descending to the cellar. When I inquired about it, Mother smiled and claimed there was an unfortunate incident during the cooking lessons. But what kind of cooking lesson could generate that much blood? February 28th. I have not seen Casimira in the main part of the house for many days. Mother states she is too unwell to perform her duties, but the noises I hear from below do not sound like sickness. They sound like... I cannot bring myself to write what they sound like. The end arrived in early March after nearly 6 weeks of relentless, systematic torment. Casimira's body, having been pushed far beyond its human limitations, finally gave out. Her heart simply ceased beating during what Guadalupe had intended to be another standard session of correction. When Guadalupe realized her victim was deceased, she experienced an unexpected blend of gratification and disappointment. The horrific process had given her the most profound sensation of pleasure she had ever known. But now it was complete, and she was left with the practical necessity of disposing of the remains. With the cold, methodical efficiency she applied to all her undertakings, Guadalupe wrapped the body in discarded linens and waited for the darkest hours before dawn to load it onto a small cart. She had already chosen a clandestine burial site in the unoccupied land at the city's expanding borders, a location where the yielding soil would accept secrets without question. As she excavated the shallow grave that would conceal Mexico's first known casualty of a female serial killer, Guadalupe made a life-altering decision. The experience had awakened an appetite within her that required constant fulfillment. She vowed to be more cautious next time, more discerning in her choice of victims and more elaborate in her techniques. But there would undeniably be a next time. Following Casimira's murder, Guadalupe entered what she considered her professional phase. She had acquired valuable knowledge from her first act of murder and was determined not to repeat the errors that had almost exposed her. The critical factors were patience, detailed preparation, and maintaining the respectable reputation that served as her most impenetrable disguise. For almost a year, she dedicated herself to legitimate commerce with renewed intensity. She organized charitable fundraising events for the local cathedral, expanded her maid placement agency, and cultivated alliances with the most influential families in Mexico City. By day, she embodied the ideal of a respectable widow, devout, diligent, and socially engaged. But her nights were devoted entirely to strategic planning. She meticulously analyzed social patterns to identify ideal victims, researched methods of restraint and torture that would be more effective than her initial crude experiments, and, most crucially, devised strategies to ensure that disappearances would generate minimal official inquiry. She also took great care to manage Aurelio's worsening mental instability. Her son had become alarmingly unpredictable, prone to sudden episodes of crying and disorganized monologues about fictitious sins requiring confession. Guadalupe arranged for him to be treated by a German physician specializing in nervous disorders, ensuring that his testimony would be immediately dismissed as the ravings of an invalid if he ever attempted to reveal her activities. The perfect opportunity she had been anticipating arrived in September 1888 when Maria Santos brought her 15-year-old daughter Elena to the mansion seeking domestic work. The Santos family had been forced off their farm by drought and debt, compelling them to relocate to the capital where employment was scarce and competition fierce. Maria was desperate enough to accept any position for her daughter, regardless of the terms. Elena Santos embodied everything Guadalupe sought in a victim. She was young, physically robust, and isolated from any social support system that might investigate her vanishing. More significantly, she possessed a quiet resilience that Guadalupe found profoundly compelling. Breaking a strong spirit offered significantly greater gratification than destroying someone who was already defeated. The girl's introductory weeks in the mansion mirrored the established routine Guadalupe had used with Casimira, but with key improvements. She was more subtle in the escalation of abuse, taking greater care to ensure that each stage of degradation appeared to be a logical progression from the one preceding it. Instead of sudden brutality, she utilized a gradual psychological manipulation that distorted her victim's perception of reality. "I have observed you making an increased number of errors lately," Guadalupe would remark with feigned concern. "Perhaps the city air is not agreeing with you. Some girls from the rural areas never properly adapt to civilized living." Elena would assert that she was doing her absolute best, which only triggered long speeches about the distinction between effort and actual achievement. Guadalupe nurtured an environment of perpetual judgment where nothing the girl did was ever quite satisfactory, creating a psychological setting that was highly vulnerable to more severe abuse. The physical punishments began as corrections for increasingly non-existent faults. A spot missed while dusting led to hours of forced motionless standing. A meal served at a slightly incorrect temperature resulted in the withholding of food. A perceived glance of defiance earned a night locked in the coal cellar without light or warmth. But Guadalupe had mastered patience. She allowed days or even weeks to elapse between escalating incidents, giving Elena time to accept each new threshold of abuse before introducing the next. This methodical strategy prevented the girl from recognizing the broader pattern until she was too psychologically compromised to offer effective resistance. Aurelio, observing this process with mounting terror, made several attempts to intervene, but his mother had foreseen this possibility and developed tactics to manage his interference. "I see you are troubled by Elena's training," she said after he asked why the girl seemed so frightened. "That indicates you possess a good heart, but kindness without judgment can be harmful. These country girls require firm guidance to overcome their inherent laziness and deceit. Would you prefer I return her to the streets, where she will inevitably descend into prostitution and sin?" When Aurelio continued his objections, Guadalupe's tone grew more menacing. "Of course, if you feel you have a better understanding of household management than I do, you are welcome to assume responsibility for the girl's moral development yourself. I am certain you would find it very instructive." The underlying threat was unmistakable. Aurelio had witnessed enough of his mother's methods to fully grasp that defying her meant becoming a victim himself. He retreated to his laudanum and his journal, documenting atrocities he was too paralyzed to stop. By December 1888, Elena Santos had been transformed from a healthy country adolescent into a hollow-eyed figure who flinched at every noise and carried out orders with the mechanical obedience of someone whose will had been systematically eradicated. Guadalupe had perfected her methods during the months of preparation, developing techniques of torture that were both more intricate and more drawn out than anything she had inflicted upon Casimira. The basement room had been upgraded with specialized equipment for restraint and inflicting pain. Chains hung from the ceiling beams, their iron links polished smooth by struggling hands. Most unsettling of all was a chair-like apparatus that Guadalupe had commissioned from a local blacksmith, allegedly for the use of an invalid, but in reality designed to secure a victim completely motionless while allowing unimpeded access to every area of their body. Elena's final ordeal was protracted over 3 days. Guadalupe had meticulously orchestrated it with the precision of a theatrical production, with each segment intended to build upon the preceding one's psychological and physical damage. She continuously alternated between periods of extreme torture and brief interludes of feigned kindness, keeping her victim constantly disoriented and unable to anticipate the next cruelty. "You see, my dear," Guadalupe elaborated during one of these short respites while applying balm to burns she herself had caused hours earlier. "This is entirely for your spiritual well-being. Every soul requires purification before it can achieve entrance to heaven, and some souls demand more purification than others." This religious rationale was a new element, a development that demonstrated how Guadalupe had incorporated her crimes into a twisted philosophy that permitted her to view herself as righteous rather than wicked. She had successfully convinced herself that she was executing a sacred duty, saving souls through the induction of suffering in ways that conventional religion was too timid to attempt. When Elena finally expired, her heart failing during a session that Guadalupe had intended to continue for several more hours, the killer felt a frustration that was almost physically intense. The anticipation had been so meticulously constructed, the progression so deliberately mapped out, that the sudden termination felt like an artistic failure rather than a human tragedy. Yet she had acquired valuable insights into pacing and methodology. Her next victim would benefit from these learned improvements, and the experience would, consequently, be more gratifying. The disposal of the body adhered to the same procedure as before, but with added precautions. Guadalupe had identified multiple sites for burial along the city's outskirts, mitigating the risk that a concentration of graves in one spot might eventually lead to discovery. She also took care to vary the timing of her late-night excursions, ensuring that no discernible pattern would emerge to attract the notice of night watchmen or early morning laborers. When Maria Santos appeared at the mansion 3 weeks later, frantic with alarm over her daughter's unexpected silence, Guadalupe was ready with a narrative carefully constructed to dispel suspicion, while simultaneously discouraging any further inquiry. "I regret to inform you that Elena fell quite ill soon after Christmas," she explained with practiced compassion, a fever that seemed to afflict her mind as much as her body. She became obsessed with the idea that her family was in peril and insisted on leaving immediately. "To alert you all, I attempted to persuade her to remain until she was well enough to travel safely. But you know how headstrong young people can be when they are concerned about their loved ones." The story was believable enough to satisfy a desperate mother's need for an explanation and sufficiently vague to render verification impossible. Maria Santos departed the mansion believing her daughter was making her way back home through Mexico's dangerous rural areas, never suspecting that Elena's remains were already being scavenged in a shallow grave on the periphery of the city. The period between Elena Santos's murder in late 1888 and Guadalupe's subsequent killings in 1892 represented the zenith of her criminal sophistication. She had learned to restrain her impulses, channeling her murderous urges into careful strategy and victim selection, while upholding a public persona that became more convincing with each passing year. During this interval, she established herself as one of Mexico City's most distinguished charitable figures. She organized relief efforts for earthquake victims, sponsored orphanages, and made such generous contributions to church construction projects that the Archbishop himself publicly commended her Christian devotion from the pulpit. This public acclaim served as the perfect shield for her private activities, making any accusation leveled against her seem not merely improbable, but virtually sacrilegious. She also developed her domestic placement business into an intricate operation that granted her access to vulnerable young women from across central Mexico. Her reputation for reliability and discretion made her the preferred employment agent for the capital's wealthy families, while her purported commitment to moral instruction drew in desperate parents who saw domestic service as their daughters' only escape from rural destitution. What these families did not comprehend was that Guadalupe had created a sophisticated screening process for identifying ideal victims. She sought out girls who were isolated from family support, psychologically susceptible, and physically appealing enough to gratify her increasingly specific demands. Most critically, she actively sought those who possessed the type of inner fortitude that would make their ultimate psychological and physical collapse exceptionally satisfying. Aurelio's condition during this time became an unintended asset. His nervous disorder had deteriorated to the point where he was largely confined to his chambers, dependent on escalating doses of laudanum and opium that kept him in a constant state of semi-consciousness. When he did appear in public, his clear instability rendered him an unreliable witness whose testimony could be effortlessly dismissed. Guadalupe carefully fostered this public perception, ensuring that physicians and family friends viewed Aurelio's condition as the lamentable result of inherited mental frailty rather than profound psychological trauma. She funded expensive treatments from fashionable alienists, publicly demonstrating her commitment to her son's recovery, while privately guaranteeing that his condition remained too volatile for him to pose any authentic threat to her operations. But beneath this meticulously maintained surface, Guadalupe was orchestrating her most ambitious project yet. The deaths of Casimira and Elena had satisfied her immediate cravings, while simultaneously teaching her invaluable lessons in methodology and victim control. Now she was prepared to attempt something far more intricate: the simultaneous captivity and torture of multiple victims, a scenario that would allow her to explore new boundaries of psychological manipulation and physical suffering. The opportunity presented itself in the spring of 1892 when Esperanza Vega brought her two younger sisters to Mexico City in search of domestic employment. The Vega family had been ruined by a combination of crop failure and political strife in their home state of Hidalgo, leaving Esperanza, at only 19, responsible for her sister's survival. Guadalupe interviewed all three girls with the measured consideration of someone assessing precious acquisitions. Esperanza was tall and robust, possessing the kind of determined composure that Guadalupe found highly desirable in a victim. Carmen, age 17, was quieter and more visibly anxious, while 15-year-old Rosa displayed a sharp intellect that suggested she might be capable of organizing resistance, if not expertly managed. "I can certainly employ all three of you," Guadalupe assured them with the maternal warmth that had become her most effective deceptive tool. "In fact, it is ideal to have sisters working together. You can support one another through the adjustment period, and I find that family members are naturally more driven to uphold the rigorous standards I require." What she neglected to inform them was that she had been preparing for precisely this arrangement, devising techniques that would enable her to utilize family bonds as instruments of torture rather than sources of resilience. Just when one might assume the depths of Guadalupe Bejrang's depravity had been plumbed, the horror in Mexico City intensified beyond imagining. If this narrative is sending chills down your spine, share this video with a friend who appreciates dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss stories like this. Let's find out together what happens when a monster decides that destroying one life at a time is simply insufficient to satisfy her hunger for agony. The arrival of the Vega sisters initiated Guadalupe's most elaborate and protracted campaign of torture. Having assimilated the lessons from her previous experiences, she now understood that the key to maximum gratification lay not in the speed of destruction, but in the deliberate cultivation of despair over prolonged periods. For the first month, all three sisters were treated with the surface-level kindness that was Guadalupe's signature tactic. They were provided with sufficient food, reasonable chores, and even minor perks, such as occasional free afternoons to explore the city together. This phase of false security was essential to Guadalupe's overarching strategy. She needed her victims to develop emotional comfort with their new situation before she began the systematic eradication of everything they held dear. The psychological manipulation began subtly, with Guadalupe strategically introducing discord among the sisters. She would commend the work of one girl, while simultaneously critiquing another's identical effort. She deliberately manufactured scenarios where the sisters were forced to compete for minor privileges, thereby nurturing suspicion and resentment where genuine unity had once existed. "I've observed that Rosa appears to be adapting more successfully than her sisters," she would remark to Esperanza during their private conversations. "Some individuals are inherently better suited for refined living. Perhaps Carmen would benefit from spending additional time with me personally, mastering the graceful conduct that comes so naturally to Rosa." These seemingly harmless observations were calculated to sow seeds of profound guilt and anxiety that would later blossom into complete psychological torment. Esperanza began to second-guess her decision to bring her sisters to Mexico City, while Carmen developed a desperate need to earn Guadalupe's approval. By June 1892, Guadalupe had successfully isolated each sister psychologically, despite maintaining their close physical proximity. They shared the same living space but no longer had complete trust in one another, each secretly convinced that she was falling short of standards that her sisters were somehow managing to achieve. This was the moment Guadalupe introduced her new victims to the basement room. The basement, which had served as Elena Santos's final prison, had been extensively modified during Guadalupe's years of meticulous planning. She had commissioned new apparatus that allowed for more accurate physical restraint and positioning, acquired medical instruments that facilitated the more controlled infliction of pain, and most importantly, configured the space to accommodate multiple victims simultaneously. The room now featured 3 of the chair-like restraining devices, positioned so that each occupant had an unobstructed view of the other's suffering. This specific arrangement was crucial to Guadalupe's advanced methodology. She had discovered that compelling victims to witness one another's torture multiplied the psychological trauma exponentially while providing her with multiple sources of morbid stimulation during every session. The first time the Vega sisters were brought down to the basement, Guadalupe maintained the pretense that this was merely an extended form of domestic instruction. "I have prepared a unique training curriculum for you," she explained with the calm authority that her victims had learned to dread. Certain aspects of proper service demand more intensive instruction than others. This chamber has been designed specifically for that purpose. The sisters were secured in the restraint chairs without any immediate physical injury, allowing them to experience the profound helplessness of their situation, while Guadalupe articulated her expectations with the patient tone of a teacher addressing particularly dull students. "The most vital quality in a domestic servant is absolute obedience," she began, slowly pacing around the room so that each girl had to strain to keep her in sight. "Obedience necessitates understanding, and understanding sometimes demands experiences that may seem unpleasant initially. But I assure you that everything that transpires in this room will ultimately be for your benefit." She then demonstrated the room's capabilities by inflicting relatively minor punishments on each sister in sequence. Brief applications of heated instruments that caused pain without permanent harm, controlled near-drowning incidents that induced panic without actual mortal danger, and carefully measured electrical shocks from a primitive battery device that a corrupt physician had supplied for her experimentation. Throughout these demonstrations, she delivered a continuous running commentary that intertwined practical direction with philosophical justification, establishing a surreal environment where torture was framed as education and suffering as a privilege. "Do you observe, Carmen, how your resistance merely exacerbates this experience for everyone?" she would remark while applying burning metal to the girl's shoulder. "And note, Rosa, how your sister's selfishness is preventing me from proceeding to more enjoyable activities. Perhaps you should encourage her to cooperate more fully." This specific technique, forcing victims to observe and indirectly participate in each other's agony, proved devastatingly effective. Within weeks, the sisters had fractured from a unified family into psychologically isolated individuals who would desperately compete for any small reprieve from their torment, even if it meant accepting increased suffering for their siblings. Esperanza, as the eldest, endured the compounded agony of feeling directly responsible for her sister's plight. Guadalupe exploited this ruthlessly, frequently reminding the girl that Carmen and Rosa were suffering because of her decision to bring them to Mexico City. "This entire situation could cease so easily," Guadalupe would whisper during the extended sessions that had become a routine evening spectacle. "All you must do is ask me to transfer their punishments entirely onto you. I'm certain they would appreciate such an act of sisterly devotion." When Esperanza inevitably made this sacrifice, Guadalupe would accept it momentarily before declaring that the other sisters also needed to share accountability for their eldest sister's suffering. The psychological labyrinth she had engineered had no escape. Every decision resulted in greater pain. Every expression of love became a weapon used to inflict additional torment. By late 1892, even Guadalupe's considerable skill in maintaining appearances was being strained by the relentless intensity of her activities. The systematic torture of 3 victims simultaneously demanded immense amounts of time and energy, leaving her frequently exhausted and at times careless about upholding her public facade. Aurelio, despite his heavily drugged state, began to perceive shifts in his mother's conduct that alarmed him more than her previous cruelties. She had started talking to herself during meals, holding conversations with invisible participants about methodologies and potential improvements. Her weight had dropped significantly. Her eyes had taken on an unnatural, feverish glow, and she sometimes neglected the fastidious grooming that had always been central to her public image. Most disturbing of all, she had begun extending invitations for him to witness her work. "I believe you are old enough now to comprehend what I have been striving to achieve," she told him one evening in December. "Your education has been incomplete without exposure to the true nature of humanity. Perhaps it is time you learned what people are genuinely capable of when adequately motivated." Aurelio managed to refuse these invitations through a combination of feigned illness and increased consumption of narcotics, but he could sense his mother's tolerance for his avoidance rapidly diminishing. He began to fear that his next refusal would result in him joining the sisters in the basement. This paralyzing fear compelled him to take the first decisive action of his adult life. Utilizing brief periods of clarity between doses of his medication, he began to meticulously document everything he had observed over the years of his mother's criminal activities. His journal entries became more detailed and specific, focusing on precise times, dates, and descriptions that could serve as admissible evidence if he ever gathered the courage to present them to the authorities. December 15, 1892. I heard 3 separate voices screaming from the basement last night. Mother claims she has only hired 2 new servants, but I know what I heard. She also remained down there until nearly dawn, far longer than any legitimate household instruction would ever require. December 20th, 1892. I discovered blood-stained garments in Mother's room while searching for additional laudanum. When I inquired about them, she smiled and claimed she had been assisting with medical instruction for the servants. But what manner of medical instruction requires that quantity of blood? December 28, 1892. Mother once again asked me to join her in the basement. When I declined, she stated that I was old enough to assume adult responsibilities whether I wished to or not. I believe she intends to forcibly involve me in whatever atrocity she is committing down there. The critical event that would ultimately expose Guadalupe's crimes began on New Year's Day, 1893, when a scheduled visit from the parish priest nearly resulted in her discovery. Father Miguel Herrera had arrived to deliver Guadalupe's annual charitable contribution receipt and discuss preparations for the upcoming Lenten season, but his visit coincided with one of her prolonged basement sessions. The priest was kept waiting in the main parlor, while Guadalupe frantically attempted to conclude her activities and compose herself. But the sounds reverberating up from beneath the house were too loud and too unmistakably agonizing to be dismissed as normal household disturbances. "Señora Bejrang?" Father Herrera asked, his concern evident. "Is someone ill in your household?" Those terrible sounds suggest someone is in considerable distress. Guadalupe's explanation that one of her servants was suffering from a fever that induced delirium satisfied the priest temporarily, but his suspicions were thoroughly awakened. As Mexico City's most celebrated charitable woman, Guadalupe was accustomed to visits from the clergy, but never before had she seemed so distressed or so eager to swiftly conclude their meeting. Father Herrera commenced discreet inquiries among his parishioners regarding the Bejrang household. What he uncovered profoundly troubled him. Several neighbors reported that the sounds emanating from the mansion had become progressively more disturbing over the preceding months. The usual complaints about standard domestic discipline had escalated into something significantly more sinister. Screams that persisted for hours, the occasional smell of burning flesh drifting from the property's windows, and the complete absence of the young servants who were supposedly residing there. Even more incriminating was the testimony provided by tradesmen who had conducted business for the household. A local blacksmith reported receiving a commission to construct restraining devices that seemed far too elaborate for merely managing difficult staff. A physician confessed to supplying Guadalupe with medical instruments and pharmaceutical agents that had no legitimate use within a domestic setting. Most alarming of all, several local shopkeepers noted that Guadalupe's purchases of food had drastically decreased, despite her claims of maintaining a larger roster of household employees. As the winter weather intensified into the early months of 1893, Guadalupe's criminal activities reached a peak of depravity that pushed even her immense capacity for cruelty into previously unexplored territory. The systematic torture of the Vega sisters had persisted for over 6 months, converting them from robust young women into shattered figures who existed in a state of perpetual fear. Esperanza, who had once been the family's protector and decision-maker, now spent her days in a catatonic stupor, interrupted only by violent episodes of hysteria when she was subjected to new torments. Her body exhibited the evidence of every refinement Guadalupe had developed in her torture techniques. Precisely located burns that formed geometric patterns across her skin, deliberately inflicted lacerations that had been allowed to heal and then reopened multiple times, and indications of internal injuries that pointed to violations too horrific to fully describe. Carmen had developed a contrasting reaction to the prolonged abuse. She had retreated so far into madness that she often appeared genuinely oblivious to the horrors being inflicted upon her, conversing with unseen entities and laughing at atrocities that should have provoked screaming. This psychological detachment both aggravated and intrigued Guadalupe, who viewed it as a direct challenge to invent new methods that could penetrate even a complete mental withdrawal. Rosa, the youngest sister, had somehow managed to retain more of her sanity than her siblings. However, this clarity only intensified her suffering. She was fully conscious of what was happening to her family, and understood with chilling certainty that their situation could only culminate in death. Her desperate attempts to negotiate with Guadalupe, to find some compromise that might save at least her sisters, provided their captor with endless amusement as she raised and then cruelly dashed their hopes with calculated precision. But Guadalupe had begun to recognize that even this elaborate scenario was nearing its natural end. The sisters were slowly succumbing to the accumulated damage of their torture, and their inevitable deaths would once again leave her without victims to sate her ever-growing demand for suffering. This realization prompted her to make the critical error that would ultimately lead to her downfall. She began making arrangements to procure new victims even before disposing of the current ones, intent on maintaining a continuous flow of subjects for her vicious experiments. The next opportunity seemed to appear when Julia Mendez, a widow from Querétaro, arrived in Mexico City with her 14-year-old daughter Isabella, seeking domestic work to survive after losing their family farm to debt. Guadalupe perceived Isabella as the perfect acquisition for her collection, young enough to be completely dominated, old enough to provide sophisticated forms of entertainment, and sufficiently isolated to vanish without triggering an immediate inquiry. However, her eagerness to secure this new victim caused her to make a series of fatal misjudgments. Instead of patiently waiting for the Vega sisters to die naturally from their accrued injuries, she decided to accelerate their demise to make space for Isabella. More fatally, she grossly underestimated the progress her son Aurelio's documentation efforts had reached and how close he was to finding the courage to finally act upon his knowledge. The night of February 14, 1893, marked the termination of Guadalupe Bejrang's career as Mexico's most successful serial killer. She had meticulously planned what she intended to be the final session with the Vega sisters, a culminating, devastating experience that would eliminate them while affording her maximum gratification before she began working with Isabella Mendez. But Aurelio, bolstered by a mix of laudanum-induced bravery and absolute terror concerning his own imminent fate, had made a world-changing decision. Over the preceding weeks of planning, he had been secretly communicating with Father Herrera, furnishing the priest with detailed evidence about his mother's activities, while pleading for protection from the severe consequences of his revelations. The evidence he supplied was overwhelming. His journals contained exact dates and descriptions of torture sessions, the acquisition of victims, and body disposal operations spanning several years. He had drawn a sketch of the basement torture chamber layout, pinpointed the location of burial sites outside the city, and, most damningly, provided testimony regarding his mother's psychological condition that depicted her as a methodical sadist, rather than a woman temporarily driven mad by grief or circumstance. Father Herrera, horrified by these disclosures but uncertain how to proceed without jeopardizing Aurelio, had spent weeks in consultation with both church officials and civil authorities. The core problem was Guadalupe's formidable social standing, which made accusations against her extremely risky to pursue without absolutely ironclad evidence. A failed prosecution would destroy not only Aurelio, but every individual involved in bringing charges. The solution was achieved when Aurelio agreed to assist authorities in gathering direct evidence by covertly facilitating access to the basement during one of his mother's torture sessions. On the night of February 14th, while Guadalupe was conducting what she intended to be the Vega sisters' final ordeal, Aurelio unlocked the mansion's rear entrance and guided a small team of investigators directly to the basement door. What they discovered surpassed even the horrific expectations created by Aurelio's testimony. The basement chamber that the investigators entered on that cold February night would permanently scar their memories. The scene that confronted them was so far beyond the scope of normal human experience that several officers immediately vomited, while others had to be physically restrained from assaulting Guadalupe on the spot. The three Vega sisters were held fast in their restraint chairs, their bodies displaying evidence of torture so systematic and prolonged that determining the full scope of their injuries would necessitate weeks of medical examination. Esperanza was unconscious, her breathing so shallow that medical experts would later express astonishment that she had survived this long. Carmen was awake but utterly unresponsive, staring blankly while tears streamed down her face. Rosa, despite her ghastly condition, was still sufficiently alert to attempt communication with her rescuers, though the words she whispered were mostly incoherent pleas for death rather than salvation. But it was Guadalupe herself who contributed the most chilling detail to the scene. When the investigators suddenly entered the room, they found her calmly proceeding with her task, displaying neither surprise nor concern at their intervention. She was attired in what appeared to be a ceremonial adaptation of her customary black garments, and her demeanor suggested someone who had been anticipating this interruption. "Gentlemen," she stated with complete composure, still holding the instruments of torture, "I trust you possess the proper authorization for this breach into my private domestic affairs." Her response, or rather the sheer lack of a conventional one, exposed the profound depth of her psychological dissociation from normal human empathy. She seemed genuinely incapable of understanding why her activities would be deemed criminal, referring to the torture sessions as moral instruction and the victims as students requiring intensive guidance. The physical evidence discovered in the basement corroborated every detail of Aurelio's testimony while simultaneously revealing additional atrocities he had been too traumatized to fully document. Investigators uncovered meticulously kept records of Guadalupe's torture techniques, including detailed drawings and notes that demonstrated she had been systematically experimenting with various methods of inflicting pain. They found surgical instruments that had been purposefully modified for torture, restraint devices that showed a sophisticated knowledge of human anatomy, and, most disturbingly, a collection of personal belongings taken from victims that served as trophies of her conquests. However, perhaps the most damning evidence consisted of the journal entries that revealed Guadalupe's total self-awareness regarding the nature of her crimes and their profound impact on her victims. Far from being driven by temporary insanity or uncontrollable urges, she had meticulously planned and executed her torture sessions with the methodical precision of a scientist conducting experiments. October 15, 1892. The eldest sister's continued resistance offers excellent chances to demonstrate consequences to the younger ones. Pain shared among family members appears to multiply exponentially, rather than simply being additive. This technique warrants further refinement. November 3, 1892. I have observed that the middle sister's psychological withdrawal can be temporarily reversed through specific applications of threat to her siblings. The human instinct for protection seems to overcome even severe mental impairment under the right circumstances. December 12, 1892. I am commencing the planning of the final phases for the current subjects. Their level of deterioration has reached a point where continued experimentation yields diminishing returns. New acquisitions will be necessary soon. The arrest of Guadalupe Martinez de Bejrang on February 15, 1893, generated a public uproar that overshadowed every other news event in Mexico. For the first time in the nation's history, law enforcement had uncovered conclusive evidence of serial murder committed by a woman, and not just any woman, but one of Mexico City's most highly respected charitable figures. The shocking contradiction between Guadalupe's public image and the gruesome reality of her crimes was so extreme that many individuals initially refused to accept the accusations. How could a woman who had donated thousands of pesos to religious charities and orphanages, who had received praise from archbishops and government officials, and who had maintained perfect social standing for decades, possibly be capable of such monstrous acts? But the overwhelming evidence was undeniable. The physical state of the surviving Vega sisters provided irrefutable proof of systematic torture. The basement chamber contained instruments and apparatus that could serve no function other than the infliction of suffering. Most significantly, Guadalupe's own private journals documented years of criminal activity with a level of detail that made any defense of denial impossible. The initial preliminary hearings began within days of her apprehension, conducted in a courtroom saturated with journalists, social reformers, and curious citizens eager for a glimpse of the woman who had concealed such terrible secrets behind a facade of respectability. Guadalupe's conduct during these proceedings offered additional evidence of her deep psychological pathology. She exhibited absolutely no remorse for her crimes, no concern for the suffering of her victims, and no apparent understanding of why her actions were legally considered criminal. When prompted to explain her torture of the Vega sisters, she responded with the patient tone of a teacher addressing particularly slow learners. "These girls arrived in my care as ignorant country peasants with no grasp of appropriate conduct or moral accountability," she calmly and rationally explained. "Through intensive instruction, I was assisting them in achieving spiritual purification that would benefit them both in this life and the next." The fact that this process involved some temporary discomfort was, in her view, regrettable but absolutely essential. Her total inability to perceive her victims as human beings possessing rights and inherent dignity revealed the extent of her psychological disorder. To Guadalupe, the girls she had tortured were not people, but merely objects to be manipulated solely for her personal gratification. Their suffering was nothing more than a byproduct of what she viewed as legitimate experimentation. The prosecution, spearheaded by Mexico's most prominent criminal lawyer, presented a case that was both exhaustive and deeply disturbing. They documented not only the immediate offenses against the Vega sisters, but also the previously unknown murders of Casimira Juarez and Elena Santos, supported by Aurelio's testimony, and the physical evidence recovered from burial sites that Guadalupe's journals had revealed. Medical experts provided testimony on the sophisticated nature of the torture methods, emphasizing that the precision and variety of techniques used demonstrated extensive planning and a considerable knowledge of human anatomy. They noted that Guadalupe had clearly studied the effects of prolonged suffering, developing methods that maximized pain while deliberately circumventing immediate death. Most condemning of all was the testimony provided by church officials who had been discreetly investigating reports about the Bejrang household for months preceding the final discovery. Their evidence showed that Guadalupe's crimes had been an open secret among Mexico City's elite, concealed not by a lack of information, but by a collective unwillingness to confront uncomfortable truths about someone whose elevated social standing made her seem above suspicion. While the legal proceedings were unfolding, Guadalupe's story captured the attention of José Guadalupe Posada, Mexico's most famous popular artist. Posada, renowned for his illustrations of current events and incisive social commentary, recognized in the Bejrang case a subject that absolutely demanded his particular skill for exposing the hidden darkness beneath a surface of respectability. Working from courtroom sketches and witness accounts, Posada created a powerful series of engravings that captured both the horror of Guadalupe's crimes and the societal conditions that had permitted them. His illustrations depicted not just the physical acts of torture, but also the psychological dynamics that had allowed such systematic cruelty to continue, undetected for years. The most impactful of these works showed Guadalupe in her basement chamber, surrounded by instruments of torture, while her victims writhed in the background. But what made the image truly chilling was Posada's decision to depict her as perfectly composed and elegantly dressed, powerfully underscoring the contrast between her civilized public appearance and her monstrous private actions. These illustrations were widely distributed throughout Mexico and beyond, ensuring that Guadalupe's story would become permanently ingrained in the popular consciousness. They also served a critical social function by compelling viewers to confront the terrifying reality that evil could hide behind any facade, regardless of how respectable or socially acceptable it might appear. The trial of Guadalupe Martinez de Bejrang concluded in September 1893 with a verdict that satisfied few observers, yet reflected the legal constraints of the era. She was found guilty of 2 counts of first-degree murder and multiple counts of torture and assault. But the death penalty, which many citizens demanded, was not imposed. Instead, she received a sentence of 10 years and 8 months in prison, a punishment widely criticized as utterly inadequate for the sheer magnitude of her crimes. The comparatively light sentence reflected both the legal system's inexperience with cases of serial murder and the lingering influence of social attitudes that made it exceptionally difficult to impose maximum penalties on women, even those found guilty of the most severe offenses. Aurelio, despite his crucial cooperation with the authorities, was also sentenced to 2 years in prison for complicity in his mother's crimes. The court acknowledged that his overwhelming fear and psychological damage had prevented him from acting sooner, but ultimately maintained that he bore some responsibility for failing to report murders that he had witnessed over a period of many years. The surviving Vega sisters encountered a more complex consequence of justice. Esperanza succumbed within weeks of her rescue, her body finally yielding to the accumulated damage from months of relentless torture. Carmen and Rosa survived the physical abuse but remained permanently psychologically impaired, requiring lifelong institutional care. Guadalupe was incarcerated in the infamous Cárcel de Belén, where her notoriety preceded her. The other inmates, many of whom were convicted of violent crimes themselves, were so utterly appalled by the nature of her offenses that she was forced into solitary confinement for her own protection. Even while imprisoned, she clung to the conviction that her actions were both justified and necessary. Guards reported that she spent her days writing in new journals, formulating theories about human nature and moral refinement that expanded upon her years of experimentation with torture victims. Guadalupe's prison experience demonstrated that even the most cunning predators eventually face consequences for their deeds. The other inhabitants of Cárcel de Belén may have been thieves, prostitutes, and murderers, but they drew a line at the torture of children. News of her crimes had spread throughout the prison community, generating a degree of hatred that made her daily existence a form of torture in itself. She was compelled to remain in her cell for 23 hours each day, emerging only for supervised exercise in a tiny courtyard, where she was subjected to a continuous barrage of verbal abuse, threats, curses, and projectiles hurled by other inmates. The guards, many of whom had families of their own, made little effort to shield her from this constant harassment. But perhaps the most fitting element of her punishment was the way it utterly stripped her of the social standing that had been so vital to her crimes. Within the prison walls, her former reputation as a respectable lady meant nothing. She was merely another criminal, and one whose specific offenses marked her as the absolute lowest form of life in the prison hierarchy. Her health began to decline rapidly under these stressful conditions. The woman who had taken immense pride in her elegant appearance became haggard and disheveled. The authoritative voice that had commanded respect in Mexico City's elegant salons was reduced to pleading whispers when she attempted to communicate with guards or fellow prisoners. Most tellingly, the isolation that had enabled her to conduct her torture sessions undisturbed now became a profound punishment that she found unendurable. Guadalupe had always defined her existence through her control over others, and the complete absence of victims to manipulate left her psychologically adrift. She died in her cell during the winter of 1895, having served just 2 years of her sentence. The official cause of death was recorded as pneumonia, but prison officials privately conceded that she had been discovered with injuries consistent with assault by other inmates. No official investigation was launched and no charges were filed. Even in death, she was afforded no more respect than she had ever shown her victims. Her funeral was attended only by a priest, who performed the service purely as a matter of duty rather than out of any compassion. No family members claimed her body, no friends mourned her passing, and no newspapers noted her death with more than a brief mention. The woman who had once been one of Mexico City's most prominent citizens vanished from history as anonymously as her victims had vanished from life. The case of Guadalupe Martinez de Bejrang fundamentally altered how Mexican society perceived criminal behavior and social respectability. For the first time, the nation was forced to confront the chilling reality that monsters could hide behind any facade, that evil was not confined to the desperate and marginalized, but could flourish in the most privileged circumstances. The subsequent investigation brought to light systemic failures that had allowed her crimes to persist for years. Police had routinely dismissed reports from families searching for missing daughters because those families lacked the social standing to compel a serious investigation. Medical professionals had provided specialized equipment and expertise for torture without questioning their client's sinister intent. Religious authorities had readily accepted her substantial charitable donations while willfully ignoring the obvious signs of abuse occurring within her household. Most profoundly unsettling was the discovery that many members of Mexico City's elite had strongly suspected the truth about Guadalupe's activities but had consciously chosen to remain silent rather than confront someone whose high social position made any accusation hazardous. The case exposed a culture of complicity that prioritized reputation over justice and social harmony over human life. These shocking revelations initiated significant reforms within Mexico's criminal justice system. New legislation was enacted, demanding the investigation of missing person reports regardless of the social status of those submitting the reports. Medical professionals were subjected to stricter oversight regarding their sales of specialized equipment and patient relationships. Most importantly, the legal concept of serial murder was formally recognized, establishing enhanced penalties for systematic killing. But perhaps the most enduring consequence of Guadalupe's crimes was the way they irreversibly changed the popular understanding of evil itself. Posada's haunting illustrations ensured that her story became a staple of Mexican folklore, a cautionary tale about the dangers of trusting appearances and the essential importance of protecting society's most vulnerable members. The basement chamber where she had conducted her torture sessions was accidentally discovered by construction workers decades later during a renovation of the property. Even after years of abandonment, the room retained an atmosphere of sheer horror that caused strong men to flee in terror. The building was eventually torn down, but local residents claimed that the agonizing screams of Guadalupe's victims could still be heard on quiet nights. This grim story instructs us that evil rarely announces itself with dramatic gestures or obvious signs. Instead, it conceals itself behind respectability, operates subtly within systems of trust, and shrewdly exploits society's reluctance to believe that monsters can wear familiar faces. Guadalupe Bejrang's crimes were possible, not because she was superhuman, but because she understood precisely how to manipulate the social structures that were supposedly in place to protect the innocent. Her narrative serves as a powerful reminder that the most dangerous criminals are often those who appear the most normal, the most respectable, the most worthy of trust. They rely heavily on our hesitation to believe that people we admire could be capable of unthinkable acts, and they use that reluctance as effective camouflage for their predatory behavior.